Just another civilian administrator, probably lost on her way back to the bursar's office. Someone get her out of here before she trips over a power conduit and sues the fleet. The voice of Cadet Commander Jorik sliced through the focused hush of the bridge simulator, sharp and arrogant. The small group of elite cadets arrayed around him, his hand-picked Aegis squad, chuckled in sycophantic unison. Their laughter was a brittle, tinny sound in the cavernous, high-tech chamber, a room designed to replicate the nerve center of a sovereign-class dreadnought down to the last glowing pixel on its holographic displays. Jorik, a young man sculpted by privilege and ambition, stood with his feet planted wide, his chest puffed out in the immaculate black and gold uniform of a senior cadet. He was the Academy's golden boy, the one destined for greatness, and he wore that destiny like a second skin. His target was a woman standing near the aft engineering console. She was of middle age, her hair streaked with a practical, unadorned gray, pulled back in a simple, severe bun. She wore a plain, charcoal gray maintenance jumpsuit, the kind worn by low-level systems technicians and custodial staff. There were no rank insignias, no medals, no indication of status whatsoever. She was utterly, deliberately unremarkable. She held a small data pad, her gaze fixed not on the cadets, but on the subtle energy fluctuations displayed on a secondary monitor, her expression one of mild, academic curiosity. She did not react to the insult. She didn't flinch, her shoulders didn't tighten, her eyes didn't even flicker in his direction. It was as if Jorik's words were mere background noise, as insignificant as the low, ambient hum of the simulator's environmental controls. This profound lack of reaction was, to Jorik, more infuriating than any retort could have been. It was a silent dismissal of his authority, of his very presence. But high above, in the darkened observation gallery, General Theron Vance, the grizzled commandant of the Aegis Command College, leaned forward in his chair. He saw past the jumpsuit. He saw past the unassuming posture. He saw the way she stood, her weight perfectly balanced, her body betraying a deep, ingrained stillness that was not passive, but predatory. It was the stance of someone who had spent a lifetime on the decks of warships, feeling the subtle vibrations of a reactor core through the soles of her boots. Vance knew that stance. He had seen it only once before, 20 years ago, in the chaotic aftermath of a battle that was still classified, and a cold dread, mingled with a thrilling anticipation, began to coil in his gut. He knew exactly who she was, and he knew that Cadet Commander Jorik was about to receive the most important and most brutal lesson of his young life. If you believe that true strength doesn't need to announce itself, that competence is its own credential, type respect is earned in the comments below. The air in Simdeck 7 was thick with manufactured tension, a deliberate cocktail of chilled, recycled air, the faint scent of ozone from the holographic emitters, and the palpable ego of Jorik's squad. This was the pinnacle of their training, the final exam before they were commissioned as officers in the fleet, the Maelstrom Run. It was more than a simulation. It was a legend, a ghost story told to first-year cadets to chasten their hubris. No one had ever successfully navigated it. The scenario was designed to be unwinnable, a crucible that tested not for victory, but for the character of a command team in the face of certain annihilation. Jorik, however, saw it as his stage. He believed the legends were for lesser men. He had studied every fragment of data on the Maelstrom, run every permutation he could devise on lesser simulators. He was convinced he had found a flaw, a narrow, thread-the-needle path to victory that all his predecessors had missed. His squad reflected his confidence. There was Rorik, his communications officer, a master of mimicry who could parrot back fleet regulations but lacked a single original thought. There was Alara, his tactical officer, brilliant with weapons theory but brittle under pressure, her confidence borrowed directly from Jorik's own. They moved around the bridge with a practiced, theatrical efficiency, their voices sharp and loud as they ran through pre-flight checks, a performance for the benefit of the watching instructors and, most importantly, for Jorik himself. The woman in the gray jumpsuit remained a silent fixture at the edge of this drama. She had moved slightly, now observing the primary power distribution grid on her datapad, her finger tracing lines of code that were invisible to everyone else. Her continued presence was a grain of sand in the perfect machinery of Jorik's command. He decided to escalate. "Seriously," he said, his voice dripping with condescension as he gestured dismissively toward her. "Does anyone know what she's even doing here? This is a restricted military exercise. We're simulating fleet-level combat operations, not calibrating the waste reclamation systems." "Ma'am," he addressed her directly, his tone mockingly polite, "I'm sure the sanitation department needs you. This bridge is for warriors." A few of the junior technicians who were monitoring the simulation from side console shifted uncomfortably. They knew she had arrived with the general's entourage, but her purpose was a mystery. They stayed silent, unwilling to cross the Academy's star cadet. The woman finally looked up from her datapad. Her eyes, a pale, piercing blue, met Jorik's for a single, fleeting second. There was no anger in them, no fear. There was nothing but a calm, analytical assessment, as if she were examining a faulty circuit. Then she looked back down at her datapad and gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, as if she had just confirmed a diagnosis. She said nothing. Her silence was a vacuum, and Jorik's arrogance rushed to fill it. He laughed, a harsh, ugly sound. "Unbelievable. The brass sends us a deaf-mute janitor as a good luck charm." He turned to his team, his voice booming with false confidence. "All right, people, let's show the cleaning staff how real naval officers operate. Initiate the Maelstrom run. Full combat parameters." The world outside the simulator's view screen dissolved into the swirling, violent chaos of a plasma nebula. The test had begun. The first few minutes of the Maelstrom run went exactly as Jorik had practiced. His commands were crisp, his strategy unfolding with textbook precision. He expertly navigated the initial gravimetric shears, using the nebula's chaotic energy to mask their approach from the simulated enemy fleet lying in ambush. Alara at Tactical called out firing solutions, her voice gaining confidence with every volley of torpedoes that struck home on the holographic targets. Rorik at Communications relayed damage reports and tactical updates with flawless recitation. For a moment, it seemed Jorik's arrogance was justified. He allowed himself a small, smug smile, glancing over at the silent woman in the jumpsuit, as if to say, "See, this is how it's done." He was not just passing the unwinnable test, he was dominating it. He had found the flaw in the system. But the Maelstrom run was not a system with a flaw. It was a system designed to create flaws. It was a learning algorithm, a predator that adapted. Just as Jorik's confidence peaked, the simulation changed the rules. A cascade failure began, not with a bang, but with a whisper. A single line of corrupt code, a ghost in the machine, started to replicate. The engineering station flickered, then went dark. Alarms, low and mournful at first, began to chime, steadily increasing in pitch and urgency. "Report." Jorik barked, his smile vanishing. "Main reactor is fluctuating. Commander." The engineering cadet stammered. "I'm losing containment." Before he could finish, a simulated plasma burst erupted from his console, and the board flashed red with a single word: incapacitated. Then the failure spread. Navigation went offline. Tactical sensors began to ghost, filled with phantom enemy ships. The bridge lights flickered and died, plunging them into the hellish red glow of emergency lighting. The confident, booming voices of the cadets devolved into a frantic cacophony of panicked shouts. "We've lost helm control. Multiple hull breaches on decks 5 and 7. I can't target them. My sensors are blind." Jorik stood frozen in the center of the bridge, his carefully constructed strategy disintegrating into chaos. The unwinnable scenario was reasserting its dominance with brutal efficiency. His flaw wasn't a flaw, it was bait. The simulation had lured him in, then sprung its trap. While the cadets descended into panic, the woman in gray remained an island of impossible calm. She had put away her datapad. Her hands rested lightly on the railing in front of her, and she watched the cascading failures on the main screen not with alarm, but with a look of intense, professional focus, like a master artisan watching an apprentice's work fall apart, noting every point of failure. The simulation controller's voice, cold and dispassionate, cut through the noise, following a script he had been given that morning. "Communications console has suffered a power overload. Communications officer is incapacitated. Rourke station went dark. The bridge was now deaf, dumb, and blind. The controller paused. The scenario requires a functioning comms link to Fleet Command to proceed. Is there anyone on the bridge qualified to attempt a manual system reboot? Jorek stared, his face pale with sweat. A manual reboot of a system this complex during a cascading failure? It was impossible. It was a death sentence. Into the heart of the chaos and the suffocating silence that followed the controller's question, the woman in the gray jumpsuit moved. She didn't hurry. She didn't speak. She simply pushed off from the railing and walked toward the dead communications console with a steady, unhurried gait. Her movements were economical, fluid, devoid of any wasted energy. The panicked cadets parted before her, their eyes wide with confusion and a dawning, inexplicable sense of awe. Jorek watched her, his mind struggling to process what was happening. "What do you think you're doing?" He managed to stammer, the words hollow and weak. She didn't answer him. She didn't even look at him. She reached the communication station, where the cadet, Rorik, was slumped over dramatically, playing his part as an incapacitated crewman. She gently, but firmly, moved him aside, settling into the command chair. The console before her was a disaster. It was dark, save for a few red error messages blinking like malevolent eyes. The standard holographic interface was gone. For a moment, she just sat there, her hands hovering over the keyboard. Then they began to move. It was not the frantic, desperate typing of someone trying to fix a problem. It was the deliberate, rhythmic, and impossibly fast movement of a concert pianist. Her fingers danced across the keys, not on the main interface, but on a small, physical sub-keyboard used for deep system diagnostics. She wasn't trying to reboot the standard operating system. She was bypassing it entirely. On the main view screen, a single green command line interface appeared, a stark contrast to the swirling red nebula and the flashing warning icons. Lines of code began to scroll across it faster than anyone could read. She was speaking the machine's native language. She rerouted auxiliary power from the life support systems, borrowing just enough energy to stabilize the comms buffer without compromising the ship's integrity. She isolated the corrupt code that had started the cascade, trapping it in a feedback loop within a partitioned sector of the ship's memory. She wasn't just fixing the communications. She was performing open-heart surgery on the entire dreadnought's central nervous system from a single, broken terminal. The cacophony of alarms began to fall silent, one by one. The emergency lights flickered, then were replaced by the steady, white glow of the main bridge lighting. The phantom ships on the tactical display vanished. The engineering station flickered back to life, showing a stable reactor core. The final, blaring proximity alert died out, plunging the bridge into a profound, deafening silence. The only sound was the soft, final click of a single key as her finger pressed enter. On the main screen, a single line of text appeared in crisp, green letters. // comms link established. Fleet Command uplink secure. Standing by the Maelstrom run, the unwinnable scenario had been stabilized. It had not been defeated in a hail of torpedo fire, but tamed by a quiet, absolute competence that bordered on magic. Every eye on the bridge was fixed on the unassuming woman in the gray jumpsuit. Jorek stared, his mouth hanging open, his face a mask of shattered arrogance and pure, unadulterated disbelief. He couldn't form a word. He could only think, "That's not possible. That's not possible." From the observation gallery, General Vance watched the impossible unfold, a slow, grim smile spreading across his face. He had seen this woman's work before, but never so up close, never with such elegant, devastating precision. He keyed his private comm in the simulation. Full stop. And give me a spotlight on the comm station, down on the bridge. The violent nebula on the view screen froze, then dissolved into the neutral gray grid of a powered-down simulator. The cadets, still reeling from the sudden shift from total chaos to total silence, flinched as a single, bright spotlight cut through the gloom, illuminating the woman at the communications console. She, in turn, seemed completely unfazed, already running a final diagnostic on the screen before her, her work not yet complete in her own mind. Then came the sound of heavy, measured footsteps on the metal staircase leading down from the gallery. General Theron Vance descended onto the bridge. He was a mountain of a man, his face a roadmap of old battles and hard decisions, his uniform heavy with the medals of a long and distinguished career. His presence instantly commanded the attention of every cadet. They snapped to attention, their fear of the simulation replaced by the more immediate fear of a displeased commandant. Vance's eyes, however, were not on them. He walked past the ramrod-straight cadets, his gaze fixed on the woman in the spotlight. He ignored Jorik completely, walking by him as if he were a piece of furniture. He stopped directly in front of the communications console, standing between the woman and the rest of the bridge crew. He did not look at a file. He did not consult the datapad. He simply stood there for a moment, letting the weight of the silence press down on everyone. Then, he turned to face the stunned cadets, his voice a low, dangerous rumble that filled every corner of the vast room. "Cadets," he began, his voice laced with an icy disappointment that was far worse than anger. "For 50 years, the Maelstrom Run has been the ultimate test of this academy. It is designed to be unwinnable. It is designed to break you. It is designed to teach you that some situations cannot be overcome with aggression or arrogance, but only endured with grace and courage." He paused, letting the words sink in. "Today, you all failed that test. You broke. You panicked. You disintegrated as a command team." His eyes finally flickered to Jorik, and the temperature in the room seemed to drop by 10 degrees. "And you, Cadet Commander, failed more completely than any cadet in the history of this institution. Not because you lost control of the simulation, but because you lost control of your judgment long before it even began." General Vance took a step to the side, gesturing with his entire arm toward the woman in the command chair, who was now quietly logging out of the system she had just conquered. "You looked at this officer," Vance's voice rose, each word a hammer blow, "and you saw a janitor. You saw a civilian. You saw someone beneath you. Your arrogance and your assumptions made you blind." He turned his back on Jorik, addressing the rest of the humbled squad. "You were taught to recognize threats. You were taught to analyze intelligence. But you failed to recognize the single most formidable strategic mind in this quadrant when she was standing 3 feet away from you. You dismissed her. You insulted her." He let a heavy silence hang in the air before delivering the final, devastating revelation. "This is not a technician. This is not an administrator. This is Fleet Admiral Eva Rostova." A collective, audible gasp went through the assembled cadets. The name was a legend, a myth whispered in the halls of Fleet Command. Rostova, the ghost, the architect of the victory at the Orion Spur, the commander who had held the line at Cygnus X, one with 3 cruisers against an entire enemy fleet, using network warfare so advanced that the enemy ships began firing on each other without understanding why. She was a phantom, a name on classified reports, not a person who wore a maintenance jumpsuit. Vance continued, his voice now taking on a reverent, almost mythic tone as he listed her qualifications. She designed a Maelstrom Run simulation 20 years ago as a young lieutenant. She wrote the command software that runs the tactical displays on every capital ship in the fleet. She holds the highest possible clearance level, a level most of you don't even know exists. The reason you have never seen her picture is because her identity is one of the fleet's most closely guarded secrets. He turned back to face her. The hard lines on his face softened into something akin to pure, unadulterated respect. The 3-star general, the commandant of the entire academy, a living legend in his own right, drew himself up to his full height. He raised his hand to his brow in the sharpest, most formal salute of his entire career. His movements were precise, perfect. It was a gesture of profound deference from one warrior to another, acknowledging a superior. "Admiral Rostova, ma'am." His voice was thick with emotion. "On behalf of the Aegis Command College, my deepest apologies for the disgraceful reception you have received. It is an honor to have you inspecting our new simulator core." Rostova finally looked up, turning in her chair. She met the general's gaze and gave him a simple, small nod of acknowledgement. "The core is sound, General," she said, her voice calm, level, and utterly devoid of triumph. "The human element, however, still requires calibration. Her eyes then moved past the general, past the stunned cadets, and settled on Jorik. He flinched as if she had struck him, her quiet words landing with more force than any shouted reprimand. The golden boy of the academy stood there, stripped bare of his pride, publicly humbled by the quiet competence he had so foolishly despised. The story of what happened on Sim Deck 7 spread not like wildfire, but like a shockwave. It wasn't shouted in the mess halls. It was whispered in the corridors, passed in hushed tones between cadets in the zero-G training modules, and typed on encrypted channels across the academy's internal network. The legend of the ghost on the bridge was born. It became a cautionary tale, a piece of institutional folklore that was more effective than any lecture on humility. The details became mythologized with each telling. Some said Admiral Rostova had rewritten the simulation's core programming with her mind. Others swore the lights had flickered back on in time with her heartbeat. The truth was more impressive than any of the fictions. She had simply been competent, and in a world of posturing and noise, that competence was a superpower. The incident was a career-ending event for Cadet Commander Jorik, but not in the way anyone expected. He wasn't expelled. He wasn't formally disciplined. General Vance knew that a public shaming of that magnitude was a punishment and a lesson far more potent than any demerit. Jorik was, however, quietly stripped of his command position over Aegis Squad. He lost his status as the Academy's golden boy overnight. His sycophantic followers abandoned him, seeking new centers of gravity. For weeks, Jorik was a ghost himself, a pariah who walked the halls alone, the weight of his humiliation a visible shroud around his shoulders. He was broken, but from that brokenness, a new foundation was laid. He stopped talking and started listening. He stopped commanding and started observing. He began to understand that his entire life had been a simulation, one where his privilege and arrogance had always guaranteed him victory. Admiral Rostova had subjected him to the maelstrom run of his own soul, and he had failed spectacularly. One evening, weeks later, he found her. She was not in a high-tech lab or command center, but in one of the Academy's cavernous hangar bays, overseeing a team of junior engineers as they conducted a diagnostic on the plasma conduits of a training vessel. She was still in a simple gray jumpsuit, a smudge of grease on her cheek, her hands holding not a datapad, but a diagnostic tool, her knuckles scraped. She was teaching, not by lecturing but by doing. Jorik approached her slowly, his posture no longer proud and defiant, but hesitant and humbled. The engineers tensed, expecting another confrontation. Jorik stopped a respectful distance away and waited until she acknowledged him. When she finally looked up, her pale blue eyes were as analytical as ever. "Ma'am," Jorik said, his voice quiet, stripped of all its former bluster. "I have no excuse for my conduct. My arrogance was a failure of character. I was wrong, and thank you. Thank you for the lesson." He had expected a lecture, dismissal, perhaps even a look of contempt. He received none of it. Admiral Rostova simply looked at him for a long moment, her gaze seeming to strip away the last vestiges of his ego, seeing the nascent officer beneath. Then she gave that same, almost imperceptible nod she had given on the bridge. She turned and pointed with her tool to a flickering readout on the conduit's diagnostic panel. "The energy fluctuations in that manifold are inconsistent," she said, her voice matter of fact. "The textbook solution is to replace the entire unit." An observant officer would notice the microfractures in the casing and deduce that the problem is a simple pressure seal. One costs the fleet 1,000,000 credits. The other costs 10. Assumptions get you killed out there, cadet, or they just make you wasteful. Now, hand me that hydro spanner. Jorik, the former cadet commander, did as he was told, passing the tool to the fleet admiral. In that simple exchange, a new kind of training began. The culture of the Aegis Command College began to change. The shift was subtle at first, then profound. The story of Jorik and the Admiral became a foundational myth. The term pulling a Jorik became academy slang for making a foolish assumption based on appearances. Conversely, to have a Rostova moment meant to solve a complex problem with quiet, unheralded competence. The unofficial name for Simdeck 7 stuck. Cadets and instructors alike began referring to it as Rostova's Bridge, General Vance, recognizing the power of the narrative, had the final log of that fateful simulation saved and archived. A single screenshot was printed and framed, the one showing the green line of text, / comms link established. It was hung not in a place of honor, but in the instructor's lounge, a quiet, constant reminder of the day's lesson. The ripple effects extended to Jorik himself. His journey from arrogance to humility became its own quiet legend. Under Rostova's informal and often silent mentorship, he thrived. She never praised him. She simply gave him problems to solve, systems to diagnose, and impossibly complex schematics to analyze. She taught him to see the ship not as a weapon to be commanded, but as a complex, living system to be understood. He learned to respect the engineers, the technicians, and the so-called cleaning staff who kept that system alive. He learned that every role, no matter how small, was essential to the whole. He discovered a talent he never knew he had, not for grand strategy, but for the intricate, patient work of diagnostics and systems engineering. He found that he was happier with a hydro spanner in his hand than he ever was with the weight of a command baton. The Admiral never stayed in one place for long. She was a ghost, after all. One day, she was there, overseeing the installation of a new quantum computing core. The next, she was gone, leaving behind nothing but recalibrated systems and a dozen newly minted junior officers who had learned more from watching her work for an hour than they had from a year of lectures. Her legacy was not in statues or plaques, but in the changed attitudes of the men and women who would one day lead the fleet. She had not just fixed a broken simulation. She had debugged the Academy's soul, purging the virus of arrogance and installing a new operating system based on humility and respect. The symbolic artifact of her visit became the simulator itself. Every cadet who entered Rostova's bridge felt the weight of that day. They saw the empty communications console not as a simple chair and keyboard, but as a throne, a testament to the fact that true authority comes not from the rank on your collar, but from the skill in your hands and the quiet confidence in your heart. It was a place where a legend was born, not in the fury of a simulated battle, but in the deafening silence of a single, competent act. A year later, at the graduation ceremony for the senior class, the sprawling assembly hall of the Aegis Command College was filled with the proud families and decorated officers of the fleet. General Vance stood at the podium, his voice echoing through the chamber as he presented the diplomas. The award for top cadet, the valedictorian once destined for Jorik, went to Alara. She had learned from his failure, becoming a more cautious, more thoughtful tactical officer. But as the ceremony drew to a close, Vance announced a special, unprecedented commendation. This year, he said, his voice resonating with deep sincerity, the faculty has chosen to award the Horatius Prize for Leadership and Humility. This award does not go to the cadet with the highest scores, nor the one with the most natural command presence. It goes to the cadet who has demonstrated the greatest capacity for growth, who has learned that true leadership begins with the admission of fallibility. He paused, his gaze sweeping over the sea of uniformed cadets until it found its target. This year's recipient is Cadet Jorik. A stunned silence, followed by a wave of surprised applause, filled the hall. Jorik walked to the stage, his steps measured and sure, but without a trace of his old swagger. He accepted the award, shook the general's hand, and turned to the audience. He didn't give a speech. He simply said, "Thank you. I will strive to be worthy of the lesson I was given." He looked out into the crowd, as if searching for someone, but he knew she wouldn't be there. Her work was done. The story of that day was now formally integrated into the Academy's first-year curriculum. The recording of the simulation was required viewing for every new cadet. General Vance himself would often lead the session, standing before the young, eager faces, their heads filled with dreams of glory and command. He would play the recording up to the point of total chaos, then pause it. "Look at their faces," he would say, his voice a low growl. "Look at the panic. Look at the arrogance that led them to this point. They thought they knew everything." Then he would point to the blurry figure in the gray jumpsuit standing at the edge of the frame. "And now look at her. She knows everything, and she has the humility to act like she knows nothing. She is not reacting to the chaos. She is observing the problem. She is not issuing commands. She is seeking a solution. Your enemy in the void will not be impressed by the shine on your boots or the volume of your voice. They will only be defeated by your competence. Look past the uniform. Look past the rank. Look for competence. That is the only thing that will save you in the dark. The lesson had been institutionalized. The ghost of Simdex 7 had become a permanent part of the Academy's ethos. True legacy isn't a story you leave behind. It's a standard that moves forward. Admiral Eva Rostova's brief, unassuming visit to the Academy did more to shape the next generation of fleet leadership than a dozen new warships or 100 revised textbooks. Her legacy was not written in reports or etched on monuments. It was encoded into the very culture of the institution. It lived in the moment of hesitation a new squad leader took before dismissing a subordinate's opinion. It was present in the extra hour an engineering cadet spent learning the systems of a lower deck technician. It was manifest in the quiet respect that permeated the halls, a new understanding that everyone had something to contribute and everyone had something to learn. The ripples of her actions spread out into the active fleet. Officers graduating from the Aegis Command College were different. They were calmer under pressure, more collaborative, less prone to the kind of reckless arrogance that had once defined Jorik. They were known for listening more than they spoke, for valuing the expertise of their crew, from the lowest ranked rating to the most senior specialist. They were Rostova's generation, and they were the finest officers the fleet had ever produced. Years later, on the bridge of a deep space exploration vessel charting a dangerous, unknown nebula, Captain Jorik faced a crisis. A sudden gravimetric shear, far more violent than anything the Maelstrom run could ever simulate, had crippled his ship. Alarms blared. His bridge crew, young and terrified, looked to him for guidance. The old Jorik would have postured, shouted orders, and led them all to their doom. But the new Jorik was calm. He remembered the feeling of that profound silence after the chaos, the feeling of absolute competence restoring order. He walked over to a young ensign at a secondary console, a nervous woman fresh out of the academy who was frantically trying to stabilize the power grid. He didn't shout. He didn't command. He put a steadying hand on her shoulder. "Report your findings, ensign," he said, his voice quiet, respectful. "What do you see?" In that moment, the true lesson was made clear. Leadership was not about having all the answers. It was about creating an environment where the right answers could be found, no matter who they came from. The quiet competence of one woman had become the guiding principle for an entire fleet. Her silence had become their anthem. For more stories where quiet competence triumphs over loud arrogance, and where silent action defines their worth, subscribe to Unknown Heroine Tales.